I'm Tim, the Brand Weaver, and this is Branding for Breweries, the podcast that helps you grow your brewery, build a better brand, and connect with more drinkers. Each week, I'm joined by the brightest minds in the beer world, sharing practical tips to help your brewery stand out and sell more beer. Let's get stuck in. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to Branding for Breweries again. And oh my, what a treat we have today. We've got a three-way conversation, ladies and gents, with the phenomenal Neil Walker, Indie Beer Campaign Lead, and of course, Head of Comms of the phenomenal Siva, and Jez, who is co-owner of Brixton Brewery. And of course, everyone knows who Brixton Brewery is. Gentlemen, how are you both?
Really good. How are you?
Very good.
Hey, fantastic. Now, guys, a massive thank you for both of you joining me today, because in the back of my mind, I've pitched this to both of you independently at times, and I wanted to have this conversation around craft beer, indie beer, and collaboratively, we've agreed that, this conversation is all going to be about, can craft beer exist without independence? Because you both sit on two different sides of the fence. You share some opinions. There are different interpretations of things as well. And I thought it'd be good that we get together for 40 minutes and chat it out. You down for that?
Sounds good to me.
All right, lads. Okay, so let's get stuck in, because we don't need the intro fluff anymore. I want to start asking questions and get your spin on it. Let's talk about the difference, shall we? So everyone talks about craft beer still. People are talking about indie beer more and more. But in your eyes, and Neil, I'll come to you first on this, but what do they mean, and why are they different things?
Yeah, I think they do mean different things to different people. I think, going back to where craft came from, obviously came over from America. It had a legal definition in America by the Brew Association, so they had a pretty tight definition on what it was and what it wasn't. And I think when that came to the UK, I think it started to be applied in a bit of a different way. It never quite fit the UK market. We had traditional real ale breweries, and craft beer was kind of used as a term for, interesting modern beer, perhaps American influenced. So people like Brewdog were using craft beer as a term, and they were very much a kind of pushback against mainstream. So it became shorthand for interesting beer from smaller breweries, perhaps in keg rather than cask. So it never quite fit. And that's one of the reasons we obviously moved in the direction of kind of indie beer, because we felt that was something which kind of united those breweries. And obviously when it came to craft beer as well, we had previously independent craft breweries that were purchased by bigger breweries, like what happened with Brixton. But before that, you had Camden and other breweries. So that, again, it made it a bit more confusing for people. So for us, they are two separate things. And I think craft beer does still mean something. I think, there's a segment of the market where people are like, okay, I understand what type of beer I'm going to get when I'm buying a craft beer. But that beer might be from a global brewer or from a brewery that's owned by a global brewer, or it might be from an independent. So it's a little bit more murky. Whereas with indie beer, we've tried to go down the route of having that clear definition in the way that they do in America.
Nice one. Jez, what's your spin on it? Do you agree?
So I'll just start by saying you introduced me as co-owner. I'm actually co-founder of Brixton Brewery, so let's get that transparency out.
Slap on the back of the hand from Tim there.
Don't want to be masquerading as an owner. So yeah, I think I agree with Neil that it's not binary. There's a lot of nuance. I think as the industry has matured, the two terms have kind of drifted, I suppose. And I think even SIBA's, kind of use of the word craft, as Neil says, is now, around their definition of independence. I think you can be both simultaneously. You can be non-independent according to their definition and craft at the same time. I think in terms of us, we see craft as a philosophy, a sense of place, those other things, and none of those things changed when we were acquired. I think both matter, but probably for different reasons.
Okay. And so I suppose the important thing is, do you think this is important for the consumer to understand the separation and definition of both of them? Neil?
Yeah, I mean, obviously from our stance, we do. And I think you can get great beers that are owned by global breweries. That's not the point, you know. And I think to Jez's point with, you know, Brixton Brewery, a lot of the same people still working there. So, you know, you're still in that community making the beer that you love. I think for me, it's just about informing the consumer of what they're buying. So I think when people are purchasing any product, they're making judgment calls on that product. And for the vast majority of people, they don't really care about ownership and other things. It's, you know, people buy Nike trainers and people buy Levi's jeans, and that's absolutely fine, and they kind of know that. But for people who are wanting to, you know, perhaps support a local business or support a small independent business, I think they should have the information about where their money's going. And the example I always use, so we're not just talking about Heineken and Brixton all the time, you know, it's wider than that. The example I always think of is with Asahi, actually. So my local cricket club, and I think I mentioned this last time I was on with you, my local cricket club's got beers on the bar, and they've got Asahi Super Dry, Pilsner Urquell. They used to have Meantime Pale Ale, they don't anymore, but they have London Pride. And they're all great beers. They're all great beers. But I think there's going to be people going into that local cricket club in Surrey and going, do you know what, I'm going to support a local business. I'm going to buy a pint of London Pride. And I think if they knew that money and that business was owned by Japanese Asahi, then they might not care. But I think there is a portion of the market that would care and would make that judgment call. So our thing is just about giving consumers the information so they can make their own choice.
And Jez, does that work for Brixton as well? Are you happy with that kind of definition and the education aspect from the consumer?
Yeah, I think transparency and trust are really, really important. I would also say, you know, the fact that consumers do care about beer, and, you know, I do think they are in the minority. I think majority maybe do not, but the ones that do are the reasons that, you know, we started breweries in the first place. You know, we care, you know, about the product. We wanted to, you know, bring something that I think, you know, had died out, which was local breweries. And, you know, going to Neil's point, you know, Surrey has some really great breweries, you know, and, you know, we actually supply beer at the Oval, and the cask beer comes from Surrey Hills Brewery, for example. And that's really important, you know, local beers being available. That's the reason we started the brewery, because we cared about that. You know, we wanted to be in the community. I think as long as consumers can see the authenticity and, you know, the integrity and the values, then, you know, they'll feel them. And you can get that from both, you know, an independent brewery and, let's say, you know, non-independent or macro brewery. You know, we don't ignore those views. You know, we know when, you know, we sold to Heineken that, you know, many doors closed. You know, that was, you know, something that, you know, we weren't naive about. We know about that. You know, we accept that. But I think if you always go for transparency, then, you know, hopefully, you know, you give yourself the trust of the consumers. You know, you'll never be able to sell to, you know, the real kind of craft beer diehards. We accept that. But, you know, there's enough opportunity out there for everyone, and doing the right thing is what's important to us.
And I suppose on that point, though, if, you know, like you say, it's being honest and transparent with your consumer, but the Indie Beer campaign have the big IB kind of logo and emblem now. You know, Brixton isn't going to the point of going, hey, Heineken is plastered in there as well. How do you feel, what's the balance that Brixton needs to kind of strike here versus the Indie Beer campaign is clearly signposting indie beer?
I think transparency is what it comes down to. And we have always been transparent. We've been proud about, you know, the opportunity that we were given and how we've embraced it, and, you know, how it's allowed us to double down on those values I talked about, you know, community and looking after our staff well, and, you know, just sort of protecting that. I think, I feel like we've done as much as we could or we should do to do that. You know, even coming on something like this, you know, shows that kind of commitment to, you know, telling consumers, you know, where we come from. I think, you know, I'm personally in quite a unique position that, I started the brewery, and we did start as a local independent brewery. And then, 5 years ago, we became fully owned by Heineken. But I'm still here, and I'm still making sure that, we stay true to our values.
So in that respect, like you say, you've done as much as you can. When does the ownership then lean back on the consumer to go, I need to know more about Brixton or any other macro, to not feel confused about what they're drinking?
Is that to me?
Sorry, man. I didn't say a name, did I?
Sorry. So the question there is like, when is it the consumer's job to work it out? Is that what
Yeah, right. Because indie beer signposts indie beer now. Jez rightly says Brixton are authentic and honest and open about what they do, but there's still an educational aspect which you talk about, that Asahi things like, oh, they should be independent, but they're not. Like, but that's a consumer thing, isn't it now?
Yeah, I think it's different. I mean, consumers definitely are confused as to what's independent and what's global. I mean, we did some research in the past. I'm not going to go into loads of stats, but we did some research in the past with YouGov and asking whether you thought a brand was independent or whether you thought it wasn't. And we showed some pictures of different brands, and it was really clear that Beavertown was the one that they were like, oh, yeah, that's an independent business. That's an independent brewery. It's not owned by Heineken or Budweiser or anyone like that. So there was that confusion, and I think part of that comes from what me and Jez have talked about, where craft beer came from, what craft beer meant to people. And YouGov's a bit of a blunt instrument. You're speaking to man, woman on the street. But ultimately that's the people that are going into pubs, and that's the people that are buying beer. So I think amongst us guys in the industry, it seems really obvious that these businesses are owned by globals or linked with globals. We're so close to it. But I think for your average consumer, they're just not that close to it, and most of them don't care. Like I say, most people are not bothered. We reckon about 70% of people would choose to drink global beers, and about 30% of people would choose to drink beers from independents. We've done some research in pubs that offer both. So it's not like we're saying everybody wants local independent beers. That's not the case, but our thing is just that 30% should have the information and make it easier. Because I think some of that 30% are currently going into pubs thinking they're buying an independent beer, thinking they're buying supporting local, when they're not. They're actually buying a beer that's from a global, whatever that global is. So for us, yeah, I think it's hard because to your average consumer, they are confused, and it is a confusing marketplace. So yeah, I think if we pushed it onto them, they haven't got the information to make the decision.
Jez, anything you want to throw in on that one?
Yeah, I think I agree. It is murky, but it's also murky on both sides of the equation, because ownership of independent breweries has changed, especially in like South London here. Private equity has bought a few South London breweries recently. They're now part of larger portfolios. And that, I think, provides a bit of a gray area from a consumer's perspective. But yeah, it's complicated.
And how does that work from your side, Neil, when there are other things that maybe challenge what indie potentially means for those breweries?
Yeah, I think where businesses get their investment from and how they get their money, so whether you get it from a bank or whether you get it from private equity, you're still kind of maintaining the control of the business largely. And where you're not linked to a global brewery, and if you're linked to a global brewery, you're obviously getting access to market through their means and into their pubs or the taps that they control. So that's one thing. And also that brewery has got a vested interest in the market, in selling their own beers, that sort of thing. So, I can see the argument on the private equity thing. And there's a lot of people that are like, I wouldn't want to buy from a brewery that's had private equity purchase. And I totally get that. And I think there needs to be transparency on that side as well. But from our position, it's more about whether they're linked to global breweries, whether they're linked to having like the power and the access that those breweries bring. If you're a small independent brewery, you've largely closed off in terms of the pubs. 70% of pubs are closed off to small independent breweries. Like if you look at the pubs in their area, if you're then purchased by a global, all of a sudden you can be everywhere and you can get access everywhere. And that isn't something that changes with investment and private equity, but it is still a bit murky and a bit icky for some people. So I think there does need to be transparency on that as well.
I mean, I think one other thing is, the playbook that these businesses seem to be following is building portfolios of brands and then going to the pub and saying, I have 6 brands for you to put on the bar, which is a similar model to, big brewers. So that also, I think, I don't know how successful that's going to be, to be honest with you, but we are seeing that coming into the market in London as well.
Watch this space, I suppose, see what happens on that kind of angle. Let's pull this back a little bit to craft then, because we delved into indie and what that means and why that's there. This evolution of craft, Neil, you talked about how from your side of things it didn't really fit the mold with what we saw in America. And then we see in the UK market, craft is still an acceptable term for the most part after investment. Jez, do you feel you can still confidently own the craft terminology at Brixton now you've gone through your growth?
I think you can if you're intentional and you're committed to those values, which is using the best ingredients, investing in the right places in your business, quality, consistency, your community. We actually didn't really start out using the term craft. I was a little bit put off by it, if I'm honest with you, when we started the brewery, which was 2013. We wanted to be a local community brewery first and foremost. I think craft around that time felt a bit like a clique, a bit of a bubble, which personally didn't sit that well with me in terms of my personal values and the values of Brixton, which are very open and welcoming. So I do think you can. It's about maintaining that philosophy and being, really committed to it.
Okay. And so, Neil, does that mean that an indie brewery can be a craft brewery as well, by your definition, or by the CEBA definition?
Yeah, I mean, it's about the businesses, and actually, to Jez's point, I think a lot of breweries have kind of turned back on craft a little bit. Even some of the ones that were the front runners in that area. If you look at someone like Cloudwater, they kind of the definition of what you would have thought as a craft brewery when they first launched, or when they the first couple of years of launching, but even they kind of started to not use it. And I think part of that was the kind of damage done by the likes like Brewdog and stuff like that. They created such tribalism and kind of like divide in the industry, where it was like us against them and push back against the mainstream, and not old-fashioned cask beer and stuff like that. And I just don't think any of that helped beer in the UK at all. I don't think that's helpful. So from our point of view, like craft beer definitely exists, and that is a term that's used for a category of beers where you're probably going to get something interesting. You're probably going to get hoppier beers that are not mainstream lagers, and I think for segments of the market that is still useful and makes sense. But for us, it's like indie beer is not really a style of beer. It's not even really a category of beer. It's about the breweries. It's about expressing the types of businesses that you're purchasing that beer from. And it could be a lager. It could be an old school bitter, or it could be, double dry hopped New England IPA. It's not about the beer itself. It's kind of about the businesses that you're purchasing from. So yeah, I think they've both got their place.
Jez, now I understand the pushback on the craft word, and it might be part of your vocabulary these days, but how do you describe Brixton in that case if you're not overly keen on the craft term?
I think modern beer is probably the one that I would use most, because, for example, Brewdog, when they came along, they were like, oh, beer didn't exist before us. And that ignores true craft brewers, which, are the cask brewers, the long legacy and history. And that just smacked of arrogance to me. And I think what we've done is we've learned, and this is true of the American craft beer movement. All those guys came over here and drunk beers like London Pride and went back to the US and got modern hops and started brewing beers with more flavor. But they're all rooted in English Pale Ale, India Pale Ale. And I think I like to think of us, if you've got a spectrum from like traditional to ultra or uber craft, we're somewhere right of the center. That's how I see us in terms of our brewing philosophy. So, honor the classics, put a modern twist on them.
Okay. And Jez, back to you as well. So naturally, Brixton has come from what would have been the definition of an indie brewery, and you cannot use that terminology now, of course. Do you respect what the Indie Beer campaign is doing because you have trod that path? Can you see, and do you get behind the movement?
Yeah, I do. With one qualification. In terms of the definition, I think you've got to have an objective definition. But I think, what I would question is, it is very nuanced. It's not binary. It's not black and white. So, for example, you can't say, okay, you're macro, you're no longer independent, therefore you don't care about the product. Your beer's not made by real people, that kind of thing. That I struggle with personally. I think we came from that place. Also, when CEBA were campaigning for the new duty relief regime, we actually wrote a letter in support of that to our local MP, pointing out that we can't pull up the drawbridge after we've been through that journey. It reawakened consumer tastes, it revitalized communities, it did so many amazing things, and we're still in that place, and we want independent brewers to thrive. That is really, really important to consumer choice, to communities, to all sorts of things. So I do. Apart from the rhetoric, sometimes I fully agree with it.
Neil, on the rhetoric side of things, from the research that you've done, is that the perception, or has this got a little bit murky and clouded somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, I think there is a lot of common ground, and I think that, as a business, clearly you've got the same ethos, you've got a lot of same people involved, and I think that's great. And the fact we're having this conversation today, I think shows you kind of like support and willing to kind of take it head on and challenge it. So I really appreciate that. I think for us, it's like, it's difficult because if you as Heineken are the guys that are controlling the taps, and they're going to be going into a pub and speaking to landlords and speaking to licensees and things, well, they're wanting to have their beers, the global beers, but they're wanting to offer a local equivalent. They want to offer a craft beer, and that'll be a beer from their portfolio. But be Beavertown, be Necro. It won't be a local independent beer. So I think whilst Brixton Brewery itself might have this really good ethos and doing brilliant stuff in that community, I think the global company's still going to be keeping other independents out. The reason we haven't got Heineken IPA, they could go set up a brewery, set up a business, get a really good brewer, get some great recipes, make some amazing IPA. Well, the reason they don't do that is because they know that you need the authenticity. You need, what Jez built with Brixton Brewery. That's the value. And I think the problem for us is that where that's being offered instead of a small local business all over the UK, that's where the issue comes. Globally owned craft beer keeps independents out of venues because it fills that segment of the bar for the licensee. And that's the reason why there's value in purchasing independent breweries is because if you set it up yourself, you haven't got the authenticity, as in if you, Heineken, set it up yourself, you haven't got the authenticity, you haven't got the market, you haven't got the values that business built. I think it's a really tricky one. But yeah, for me, we want to see better access to market. We want to see more independent beer represented. And again, I go back to that 70-30. We're not saying every single bar needs to be a craft beer code. It should be all independent beer. But we're just saying that most pubs should have at least a couple of local independent beers on because there's clearly demand for it.
And Jez, I suppose when you hear that, like you must have been grafting as Brixton, as an indie going, yeah, we want to be on more taps. Then, of course, you found yourself in what you describe as a fortunate position to have access to those taps. And to me, it's almost like you can't have your cake and eat it sometimes, where I don't suppose there's a huge amount of indie brewers who would naturally say, we want to get to the level of Brixton. There might be lots. But it must be such a challenging position for you to find yourself in because now you have access to market that you didn't have before. You put the effort in, but there's almost a slight negative stigma that comes with that as well.
Yeah, but you want your brand and your business to reach its full potential, and that opportunity was one that I think a lot of brewers would not turn down. We were very fortunate to have it. Very proud of it as well, but grateful. I think there's a few moving parts. The other challenge I think for craft in particular, or the styles of beer that we produce, is there's less room for them on the bar. Whereas venues may have had multiple pale ales, they're probably only going to have a pale ale. There's other beers that have come into the category, fruit beer, for example, more cider. The real estate in a pub is quite limited, shall we say. And also the pressures on hospitality are huge, and therefore every independent free trade business is having to make some tough choices. I think we've got to watch out, as a collective, independent, non-independent craft brewers, the styles that, we really make sure that, we keep that place on the bar. I think craft is probably, it was I think up to 7% of the market. I think it's below 6 now. It's really, really suffering. So I don't think you can blame lay all the blame at, the global brewers who own craft brands. I think it's a challenge across the industry. And because craft is often the most expensive beer on the bar, and we're in a cost of living crisis, it's disproportionately affected by that.
Is that what you're seeing as well, Neil, from the data that you've got?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It's hugely challenging in the market. I mean, people are drinking less overall as well. I think there's an argument to be made that people perhaps drinking less and drinking better, so they're not drinking as often. But when they are purchasing, they're perhaps spending a bit more per time and things like that. I mean, on the kind of like craft side, so if we're talking like the keg IPAs, things like that, definitely, they're one of the more expensive beers. But cask beer tends to be, lower priced actually, and we're seeing a big spike in younger people drinking cask beer, and I think part of that is because they want interesting beer, and it's kind of having a bit of a thing is cask beer. But I think part of it as well is that value proposition. I think we're saying younger people not drinking. Well, it's £7 a pint in London, so I can see why they're not drinking. If you're not earning enough money to be able to go out and drink, you're not going to be drinking in pubs. But from our research, we're seeing those people come through now, and I think certainly in cask that is really, really good. But yeah, it's tough in the marketplace. We're losing too many pubs, we're losing too many breweries, and it is because of all those market pressures that Jez talks about. I think there's stuff that's going on through government, and they're doing a market access review at the moment. We're waiting to find out what's happened with that. We saw in Scotland them doing a guest beer right, so at least one guest beer in any pub, like the Tide pubs, and that's been pretty successful in Scotland, and that's certainly something we would like to see in the UK. And that's not just about like guest cask beers; it is, you can get a guest keg beer in as well. So yeah, for us, you've got to open it up and give independents a chance, but there are huge market pressures for everybody, and we support the campaigns that are going on at the moment as well with VAT and things like that. Getting a lower VAT rate for hospitality would be huge for all of these businesses. So yeah, there's big pressures across the board, I think
there's a lot of price pressure on breweries as well, and that is not sustainable in the longer term, which is a real challenge for us as craft brewers.
Neil, I talked to Jez about the indie beer campaign and the respect and what he feels about that. Are there things that you think the indie beer breweries can be looking at more of your macros and going, actually, there are things that we need to take from that playbook to better our offering or whatever it is that we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to get it. We've kind of always had the heart argument is the way I would describe this. So we've got a really strong emotional argument for why you should buy an independent beer. This is our business and these are the people that run it and that side of things. And I think we've not really thought in global terms in terms of the head. So what's the financial argument? What's the reason that you as a licensee should be stocking these independent beers? It isn't just, please help us. We deserve love because we're little independent breweries. It's here's why it would be more successful for your business. I mean, we've been doing some work with Waitrose recently and kind of a little glimpse into some of their sales data and things like that. And indie craft beer in their venues, that's what they describe it as, indie craft beer. So it's anything that's independent in that section of the store, in terms of their data, is flying. So it's outselling, global craft beer in their venues. And I think independents need to get a hold of more data like that. We try to facilitate some of that, but there needs to think in business terms like the globals do. What's the argument? Why should this venue take my beer? And why is it going to financially benefit that business. And I think that's something we're trying to help. And I think smaller breweries are getting better at it. I think some of the success stories we've seen in independent breweries like Thornbridge, like Salt and stuff like that, they've got really good people in there that have got good business heads. And I think moving away from I just want to make great beer to I want to run a great business is more and more important. And I know this is something you feel passionately as well, in branding for breweries, because you've got to be smart. And I think that's what you can learn from the globals.
That must be nice to hear, Jez. You've got to be smart, mate. How's that feel?
No, I think Neil's right. I think data and category and all that kind of thing. And I've met Jordan, the Waitrose buyer, and he's very passionate about independent beer, and I think that's fantastic. And I think that aligns really well with Waitrose values. So it's the perfect partner for that kind of thing. I think in terms of what other things, I think operational efficiency, processes, procedures, business maturity. And by the way, we mature every year. We're kind of going on that maturity journey ourselves. And I'm not saying that we're fully adults yet, but I think those kind of things are important. I think there was a moment in craft beer a few years ago when it was really exposed how some of those things had gone quite badly wrong in certain businesses. A bit of a reflection point, I suppose. We certainly looked at that and thought, we probably need to do more in certain areas, for the business, the team. And I think marketing is also something, that smaller independents could look at. How do you market outside the bubble? How do you get more awareness? Because you have very limited resources as an independent in order to do marketing. Your reach is very limited, but there are ways like looking at data that you can target things in the most efficient manner, understand your consumers better. I think that is something that I would recommend. What does your brand stand for? Really interrogate your brand and who you're talking to, and who you're targeting, because I think if you do that, you give yourself a good opportunity. I think one thing that one business that I think is doing well at doing that at the moment, which, is craft, maybe not, is Jubel. They are on a tear at the moment. They're growing very rapidly. They've really looked at their consumer and they've worked out who they're targeting. It's a younger demographic who perhaps are not drinking craft in the way that we perceive craft beer. And, they haven't done that with the help of a macro. They're doing that on their own merit. And I think, looking at businesses like that, I think is also important to take learnings from.
Would Jubel be considered indie, Neil?
Yeah, they are. I think they're producing in the UK. I'd have to double check, but I think they are. I think they meet the definition.
Yeah,
I think the one that people will be surprised they are. I think when I looked, I assumed actually they were European brewed, but they're not. And as Jez says, they're on an absolute flyer. I mean, I think they make a really good product for a section of the market that wants that type of beer. Fruit's a lot cheaper than hops as well, so you can make something actually and have a decent price point. And they've been out there, in the right places, at the right festivals, getting it in the hands of people, focused on marketing, kept the product nice and simple. I think they're doing really, really well.
I think they're the counterfactual to saying that there's no opportunity on the bar, because they've carved one out, albeit in a slightly different category.
That's an interesting point, actually. Yeah, it's do the same as everyone else, and of course there's going to be more and more challenge, but take that slight sidestep and at least you open up that opportunity for a different conversation with whoever's going to.
And there's a lot of people looking at the same category now, because the younger cohort is probably drinking less craft, including us.
I just want to circle back a little bit on kind of the communicating ownership transparently. And Neil, this is more directed to you. Like, is there a macro brewery who you feel is successfully communicating what the consumer needs to see on the bar very well? Because this is the first touch point a lot of the time, isn't it? Like, you come to the bar and it's like, oh yes, I know that these guys are at Macro. Is there someone who's doing it well?
Do you mean in terms of like they're communicating that a previously independent business is now owned by a global?
Correct.
I mean,
yeah.
No, I don't think anyone's doing that really. But I mean, I think at the point of sale on the bar, you have got such a limited amount of space and opportunity to do it, and to get that message across there is going to be difficult. But I do think there's like an authenticity that's needed. I mean, you know, you look at kind of like what some of the independents and small independents have done. I mean, look at someone like I don't know, Daleside being purchased by Roosters, but like was so open and honest about it. And it was, you know, one Yorkshire business to another, and then was like, right, well, we will be shutting down production. We'll be then making the beers at Roosters, but the guys that own the business want to retire. They've built a great business. They've sold it to us, and we're going to keep making it. And they're really upfront about it. But they're not going to put on every single pump clip, did you know this is owned by Roosters and things like that. So I can see the argument, but yeah, I don't think there's any globals really that are being totally upfront with consumers, but they're running businesses, and that's what big business does. So it's our job really, if we want that clarity in the market, to do things like the Indie Beer campaign, to make people aware, to get the consumer awareness, so that when someone sees a pint of London Pride, they think exactly what we think. They think, oh, well, it's London Pride, it'll probably taste all right, but I know it's owned by Asahi. If we do our job properly, then consumers will be educated and can make their own choices. But yeah, I don't think there's any globals that are putting it front and center. And yeah, I suppose why would they really?
Yeah, Jez, I suppose you would agree that there's no point of you slapping a massive Heineken logo somewhere on the Brixton clip.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that would work. I don't think, I think you can see when you go into pub, at least I can, who is the lead brewer in the pub by virtue of the brands that are on the bar. But you need a certain amount of knowledge and education to be able to do that. And, there will be, some independent brands alongside that. I mean, when I hear that question or that argument, I'm like, well, how do you do it? Do you make the staff wear a t-shirt, or do you put it on the pump clip? And, if you're going to do it for, global owned brand, then you should probably do it for every brand, full transparency. Then the consumers can make a truly informed decision beyond that binary argument that, that you see.
I suppose, Neil, this comes back to what you were saying. It more falls on the Indie Beer campaign to make sure that those who are indie are signposting that, so macros don't have to signpost the alternative, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think, to the point about the lead brewer thing, I think, your average consumer kind of goes into a pub, sees a range of beers, doesn't think for a second that there's any link between those beers. It wouldn't even cross people's minds. But we just want to see a greater range where genuine independents are represented, and get that communication across to people, so that when they're walking in, they're going, oh, there isn't any local independent beers on here. They're not thinking that there is. It's that illusion of choice that is the real danger for independents. Because when pubs think, oh, I've got a decent range on, and when consumers go in and think, oh, I've got a decent range on, oh, so they've got a decent range on, then that's the issue. Because we've got to make the point that there is a problem. There is a problem that's solving, and that you're not giving the consumer what they actually want, which is local independent beers. And that goes back to that kind of like heart and head argument I was talking about. It really comes down to that. You've got to be able to go into a pub and say, look, I know you think you've got a good range of beers on, but actually there's a segment of the market where you are not going to get them in, because they do have the knowledge, they do have the understanding, and there's nothing here that they want to drink. But yeah, it'll fall to us, because we're the little guys that's trying to fight up. We can't expect, global brewers to do our fighting for us. And it's just about carving out that niche within that bigger market. But yeah, it's always going to fall to us.
I think one exception, and you mentioned them, Salt, they have a deal with Molson Coors, and I don't think there's any ownership involved. So Molson Coors includes Salt beers, Alpaca Lips and Felt, I think it's called, in their range. They don't have the craft beer brand that they own. They used to have Hop Stuff, but they don't use that brand anymore. So yeah,
like a distribution partnership or something.
Yeah, I think so.
Another murky water area, isn't it? That one then, isn't it? Oh, tricky. All right, chaps. I mean, well done. This has been a phenomenal conversation, very respectful as well, as I hoped it would be. Let me just put one final question to both of you, and I'd like to get your take on it. And this potentially just a bit of a recap on what we've discussed, though. But Jez, we'll start with you, bud. If I put two identical beers in front of a drinker, one's from an indie brewery, one's from a big macro, they taste exactly the same. There's no branding on the glass whatsoever. It's the liquid in the glass. Should ownership really matter?
I think to the beer, it doesn't matter, not to the beer itself, but to the consumer, I think it can, yes. They're buying a relationship, they're buying a story, they're buying, a set of values. And I do think that ownership is part of that story, but it's not the whole story. I think the brewery, whether they're independent or, owned by a macro, has a say in that story and they can influence it. And, I think that I would say is the most important part is, how intentional and what actions and how they behave and how they resonate with the consumer as a result is what's important, I think.
Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this highly hypothetical scenario that you've created for us, thank you.
Oh, come on! I'm allowed to mix something up here.
I think if you're in the situation where you've got two identical glasses of beer in front of you, you haven't purchased them; they're just in front of you, and you taste them and taste the same. Where's the issue? But in most situations, they will have purchased it, and actually, in that purchasing decision, to the points I've made throughout this, I think they've got to have the information because it is based on more than just the product in the glass. It's based on what type of company they are, what they want. Me as a consumer, am I looking for something which is not mainstream? I'm looking for something which is a little bit alternative or whatever. And then the second point I would make is that, we do this. We do blind tastings at international beer competitions around the world, and it is the independents that predominantly win those competitions. So we do have blind tastings where exactly this happens and there's no branding and there's no name on the glass and they choose the independents. So I think I think if you're buying the beer especially, it does matter to people.
Phenomenal. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning. Everyone who's listened as well, you're all amazing, you're all rock stars. I think the important thing is that there is a lot of shared ground here. There's a lot of kind of shared opinions. And we are all fighting a very similar fight and doing the best that we can for beer and the consumption of beer out there. Be you call it craft, independent, modern. It's about doing the best by the people at the end of the day. So those of you who need to check out Brixton, if you've not heard of them before, you'll find them on socials and online. Of course, Neil, the Indie Beer campaign is all over. They just need to Google for it. And same with Seba. Gents, once again, thank you so much for your time. Everyone, thank you for listening, and I'll catch you again soon. Cheers, guys.
Great.
Cheers.
That's a wrap on this week's episode of Branding for Breweries. If you got something great from it, hit follow, like, and subscribe on your favorite streaming app. Or even better, leave a review, share it with your brewery pals, or get in touch, because I want to chat to you. Rock on!